Province integration is one of EU5's hard limiting factors. Until you've integrated your provinces, you won't see very many benefits from them. And unless you integrate them quickly, you'll suffer a lot of revolts, not only in those provinces, but across your nation. And surprisingly, art helps you prevent this. So today, we're going to be answering the question of what the hell is art in EU5? What do we need to do to speed up our province integration? And why is it important? So say you're playing Castile, and you just found yourself at war with Granada. Things are going pretty well. You're wiping the floor with them, destroying their armies, and occupying their land. And you just annex their country in your peace deal. And you've quickly realised that you've got no control of that land. It's not productive. It's not contributing to your economy, and you need to integrate it. This is because you get some serious debuffs if your province isn't integrated. You get a small amount of buffs if it's integrated but not cored, and then you get some buffs when it's your core. And surprisingly, the most important reason to integrate your provinces isn't that control buff you get, it's to stop revolts, and you reduce separatism by getting to high levels of integration. Not only can revolts upend your entire country, but they can empty your estate coffers too, particularly your clergy and your nobles, as if they're paying into a revolt, they'll quickly spend all of their money on that rather than making buildings in your nation, such as our clergy down here making a sawmill. So after you've just taken land, you need to integrate it. So you go into your cabinet actions and you assign a cabinet member to integrate that province. By clicking on the cabinet action, you can see the land you've got available to integrate. There's only a tiny passive growth of 0.1 per month for passive integration, which means that ultimately you kind of need to do your cabinet action for everything you integrate. And even just right at the start of the game, we only have 2 cabinet slots, but we've conquered 3 provinces, which means that a backlog is already forming. So how do we clear this backlog and speed up our provincial integration? Well, the easiest modifier to affect is the strength of your cabinet minister that's overseeing the integration. So you can chuck them into your cabinet at a small cost, and you can give your cabinet right to women too, just clicking on the character in your People's tab and granting cabinet right, but it will cost 20 legitimacy. And their stats will directly affect their skill and what they're contributing to the integration effort and how quickly it's being done. This all piles into your cabinet efficiency and is heavily affected by your leader skill. As you can see, we get a 40% boost due to our 80 military skill from King Alfonso. And it's also affected by stuff like buildings, like a chancery or a royal court, estate privileges such as royal marriage rights. You get 1% cabinet efficiency for every 1% crown power you're above 25%, technologies such as meritocracy, and some various policies in your laws. Notably, appointing someone head of the cabinet gives a huge 25% efficiency buff, but ultimately, there's too many to just list generally. But you get the point. Your cabinet efficiency is a huge building block behind your integration speed, as it's done for your cabinet. And there's a lot of modifiers that apply on top of this, such as your power projection, some buffs you get through your laws. The most common example of this being your de jure laws, the by blood choice, rather than by tradition, buffing your integration speed by 10%. But you progress this on a provincial level and a location level. So for example, Almeria integrates slower because it's a town, giving a minus 25% reduction. If it was a city, it would be minus 50%, whereas rural provinces just stay stagnant, the normal value. But the big modifier here is you can see at the bottom, Castilian cultural influence versus Andalusi cultural tradition, giving a 7% buff. This is quite good, but this isn't the norm. If your cultures are quite unbalanced, you can get big buffs or big debuffs to your integration speed. This scale is between minus 50% and 50% in your provinces. So it's a huge buff or debuff that you need to be aware of. And if you didn't know, rather than integrating a whole province at one time, if you only have to integrate, let's say, one location in that province, then your entire progress is just funneled towards that one location, meaning there is no buff to doing states at one time. If you have enclaves, you can prioritize them, and it will funnel that progress into that location. As you can see, we get a full free progression in this one island that we're integrating on its own in Laconia. But back to the gigantic buff with your cultural tradition and your cultural influence we were just talking about. You can find this in your society tab under culture, where you've been accumulating these 2 values for likely most of the game. And you can see the other culture's values by hovering them. For example, in this Naples game, we're integrating Tunisian provinces at the moment. So if we hover over Tunisia, we can see they've got 124 cultural tradition and 23 cultural influence. Don't feel bad if you've been ignoring these values for a while. They're not the most obvious things in the world to understand, and they're very different to what was in EU4. So as you can see, we get a 23.4% buff to our integration speed because our relation with Tunisian culture. We have 200 cultural influence, and they have 124 cultural tradition. So if we can increase our cultural influence, we can integrate their provinces faster, and this is a static value, so you can apply it to other cultures too, around the map. But this also goes for cultural tradition too, as if we can reduce their cultural tradition, then it will increase our integration speed, as the relative difference will be more. So how are these values accumulated? And how do they decay? Well, your cultural tradition ticks up monthly from your work of arts and your locations. You can also increase it through events that come up throughout the game, but they are quite costly. Whereas your cultural influence is increased through your prestige, your locations, and has a lot of additive buffs, such as innovative, for example, the value, being in Renaissance, having a common language as your court language, and censorship. So before you start locking your country down, like 1984, you need to know it decays too. It decays by 5% total per month. So you'll quickly find an equilibrium point between how much you get per month and your total amount decaying. So any increases or tiny little buffs that go into it are actually quite minor. So you have to work really hard throughout the game to get as many as possible to increase this equilibrium. So an easy way to explain it is your cultural tradition is your cultural defense, and your cultural influence is your cultural offense, or your cultural attack. So using the Tunisian culture as an example, because the decay of cultural tradition is so high, your cultural defense, if we assimilate provinces out of their culture, or reduce the amount of pops in these regions, then their cultural tradition will be lower, which means it will be easier to integrate, and it will progress faster, as we take more and more of their land and convert it to our culture. So in terms of these location effects and how much do they give, apologies for the over-tool typification by the way, blame paradox, your cultural tradition is mostly affected by the literacy of your nobles in that province. As you can see, it has varying values depending on their literacy. Whereas your cultural influence is mostly dependent on your buildings, such as universities and libraries in those provinces, so another reason to invest in these type of buildings. There are also some useful privileges here to buff both your cultural influence and your cultural tradition. An elaborate court life in the nobility estate is a big one. 20% cultural influence, or your cultural attack, is ginormous. But the cultural leader only gets these buffs from cities they own. So for example, we own Tunis, which is no longer giving any cultural influence buffs to that nation because they no longer own it. It's our territory. Be careful not to go over your cultural capacity limit, which murders your cultural tradition, influence, and your cabinet efficiency, which will drastically reduce your integration speed. Especially with how high the decay is, your values will fall really quickly, and you'll reach a new, significantly lower equilibrium point. And you directly get cultural tradition from works of art too. So it's finally something that you should focus on in the game. The amount and quality of art in a location gives you significant buffs, and they last the entire game. So don't be thinking art is useless. Whilst it is an investment, don't get me wrong, these buffs do add up, and they are considerable, as it shifts up that equilibrium point for you. Point 1 might not seem a lot, but when you consider decay as 5%, it's significant. And finally, there's a lot of advances you can do to buff both of these, such as Renaissance Court, giving 10% flat buffs to both, Renaissance giving a 5% to cultural influence, and they all add up. Finally, the last way to integrate a lot of provinces quickly is to do it diplomatically at the same time, so creating a lot of subjects, whether it's custom subjects with one state so you can integrate them fast, or historical ones, like the Emirate of Granada, that will just get cores on that entire area. So when we come to integrate them later, we won't have to manually integrate them, we will just get those cores transferred to us. So I'm sure you can see there's a lot more that you can do to increase your integration speed, rather than just your cabinet, or your cabinet efficiency, or who's in charge of your nation. It's quite a strong effect, so you really need to focus on it, but if you're working on it throughout the game, you can see some big rewards. So which cultures are you going to start picking on next? By the way, I'm slowing down the uploads over Christmas a bit, but if you've enjoyed the content, please consider subscribing. So thank you for your support so far, and have a great day.